Today, we are recognizing May as Mental Health Awareness Month and learning about the essential role social and emotional learning has in education. We are joined by members of the Children's Defense Fund Ohio and the Sheffield and Sheffield Lake City Schools to learn what social emotional learning is. I'll probably refer to it, and they may as well, as SEL. How it supports the whole child approach to education, and how it helps students regulate their emotions so that they are able and ready to learn, develop positive self-identities, and build rich relationships with their peers and educators. And I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but first we'd like to start our Lunch and Learns with a brief update on honesty and education overall in our state.
And
yes, Cynthia.
Your slides are not advancing. Do you want to click on the slides?
Yes, thank you. Okay, there we go. Okay. Is my chat screen in the way of the slides, or does that not show in my share screen? Okay, I just wanted to check. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so since the last Lunch and Learn, we've had the excitement of a new bill in Ohio, House Bill 616. It was introduced in April, and no committee has been assigned to it yet. House Bill 616 picks up the themes of House Bill 322 and 327 in prohibiting divisive and what it deems inherently racist concepts such as critical race theory and intersectional theory, the 1619 project. And it adds the censorship attributes of those bills with the homophobic and transphobic tenets modeled after Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. So in addition to prohibiting the quote divisive and inherently racist topics in K through 12, that 322 and 327 prohibited, it also prohibits education and discussion of sexuality and gender identification or gender identity in K through third grade completely, and mandates what it characterizes as, or that discussions of those topics in fourth grade through 12th grade be age appropriate. No definition offered for what appropriate means there. And it includes the funding and licensure penalties for House Bill 322 and 327 remain in their committee. They haven't moved anywhere, but we're not forgetting about them, and encourage you to continue putting public pressure on committee members as well as your local school board members not to move the bill and oppose 616. Also, recently, the Ohio State Superintendent process has moved to the next stage of identifying 3 finalists for the position. The board held a special meeting last week where they narrowed the short list from 7 to these 3 you see on the slide, and they will interview the finalists at the May board meeting on May 9th and 10th. You can learn about each of these candidates in the Honesty for Ohio Ed website, but also there was a article in the Plain Dealer, cleveland.com this morning featuring more information on each of them. I'll just mention a couple things. So a week or so ago, there was some ethical concern expressed because Stephen Dakin, who is the former superintendent of Reynoldsburg, and had been the vice president of the state board, took himself off of the process for selecting the new superintendent in order to run for the position. And he had been leading the superintendent search and reviewing the candidates until he decided to join the candidate pool. So there was some question about that, the appropriateness of that. Laura Hancock, the politics reporter for the Plain Dealer, recently released an interview, and that's what's featured in the Plain Dealer, including remarks by each candidate. And the interview revealed some concerning comments from Larry Hook, currently the superintendent of Springboro Community City School District, comments that reflected his anti-honesty in education alignment and opposition, as well as opposition to public health mandates that were being advanced in the state during COVID and ongoing. Lastly, Thomas Hosler is superintendent of Perrysburg schools. He wants to prioritize mental health and education and supports the department's strategic plan. He explicitly targets the teacher shortage crisis and has been a strong proponent of the Fair School funding plan. Last point to mention, recently, everyone probably knows we had primary elections and have a couple results. I won't go through all of this, but we now know that Nan Whaley, former mayor of Dayton, Ohio, will run against Governor DeWine. Tim Ryan, Democrat, will run against J.D. Vance, is the winner of the Republican primary. He's the candidate who wrote Hillbilly Elegy and obtained the endorsement of our former president. Let's see, what else? Okay. And there are also a couple Supreme Court positions that are open, including the Chief Justice position, for which Jennifer Brunner is the Democratic candidate and Sharon Kennedy is the Republican one. While I mention the Supreme Court, I will also mention that there was a decision released yesterday by the Redistricting Commission to resubmit the state legislative plan that our Supreme Court had already rejected back in February as being illegally gerrymandered, leaving the Supreme Court to decide whether to hold the commission in contempt or let the clock run out on the federal court's order to use that gerrymandered map from February. So that's still open. Okay, now I would like to get to our guests for whom we are grateful. We have Alison Paxson, who is the Communications and Policy Associate from the Children's Defense Fund, Ohio, teaching us about social emotional learning in education. And we also have Andrew Smith, the district social worker for the Sheffield and Sheffield Lake City Schools. He is chair of the Ohio Education Association's Wellness Cadre, and I'm going to ask him to describe that for us because it's a resource that began during COVID and sounds like it's doing some truly terrific activities and is a great resource that hopefully will persist after COVID, and is also the local union president for his union. So Scott, if you want to say a little bit about the cadre when you have your time after Alison, that would be great. Alison, please feel free to get started. I will bring up Alison's slides. Just give me a moment. Oh, wait, they're already in. Okay, we're good. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. And actually, if you could advance to the first slide.
You got it.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Paxson. I'm the Policy and Communications Associate for the Children's Defense Fund, Ohio. And so just briefly, the Children's Defense Fund is an organization that was born out of the civil rights movement. We have been here in Ohio advocating on behalf of children for the last 40 years. And we champion policies that lift children out of poverty, protect them from abuse and neglect, ensure access to quality healthcare, education, and nutritional wellness. And so next slide, please. All right, and so this first slide, I have 3 images on the screen. And so essentially the question I want to pose to you is, what do these 3 images have in common? And if you're on your phone, it might be hard to see, but essentially here we have 3 images, which are clearly, math exercises from math textbooks. But the answer I'm looking for here is that not only are these excerpts from math textbooks, they're excerpts from math textbooks that were recently rejected by the Florida Department of Education for containing prohibited topics or unsolicited strategies relating to social emotional learning. And so I thought this would be good context in light of, of course, our topic today in terms of SEL, and what this specifically has to do with Ohio, right? And so the same politicization of the term social emotional learning is happening here too, and misinformation around what SEL is or what it isn't has grown even louder, especially recently. But social emotional learning in schools has been, for the most part, pretty non-controversial up until recently. If anything, it has had pretty broad bipartisan support among caregivers and families, among educators, school districts, business leaders, and state leaders. And this includes our own State Board of Education, which in 2019 voted 11-6 to adopt voluntary social emotional learning standards for school districts. And so this was just a couple of years ago. As in any innovative practice, there's always a healthy level of debate about what quality actually looks like. But SEL, by and large, has been pretty widely supported because it's driven by research and by data and best practices for family and student-centered engagement to support the whole child. So this is not driven in any way by ideological or political agendas. Social emotional learning long predates the manufactured crises that we've seen in critical race theory, and it actually has its roots in the late 1960s when notions started to emerge of the importance of supporting the whole child to promote academic outcomes. And this emerged from Yale University. And so while the terminology for social emotional learning is being incredibly politically charged right now, and while this terminology has changed over the years, the importance of social and emotional wellness to student learning has not. And if anything, the research to support it has grown. But of course, now, as we see through several of these images where you might be asking yourself, why would helping students overcome math anxiety by writing their own math biography, why would that be problematic? But we see this term being commandeered for political purposes, being used as a fear-mongering tactic to essentially erode trust in public education and to rally a political base around wedge issues, specifically those relating to race and to gender. And so bottom line here with this slide, I want to show that, it's really easy to weaponize something that people do not understand or do not have a clear definition of. And that's exactly what's happening here. So let's go ahead and define it. Next slide, please. So social emotional learning is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible, caring decisions. This definition comes from Castle, which is a leading authority on social emotional learning in the field. And Castle was created in the 1990s. Once again, this is nothing new, to build collaborations with school districts, academics, and other stakeholders to build out a body of research and evidence and innovative practices in education. And so Castle also creates common set of terms and definitions for the field, as we can see here. Next slide, please. And so SEL is built on 5 key competencies within it. Those are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. And these lifelong skills prepare children to build and maintain positive relationships, to excel academically, to collaborate in the workplace, and to make responsible decisions. And that's why SEL has been so heavily prioritized within our state strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future, and within the Whole Child framework that you can see here. And so in our state's plan, SEL is one of 4 key learning domains. And it really does bear equal weight in a child's learning, equal to that as the content itself and things like foundational knowledge and skills. And this is really key because education is not just what is taught, but also how students learn. Young people need environments where they feel safe, where they feel valued, seen, and heard. And this is a key building block to feeling confident and to feeling productive in the classroom and outside of it. And so SEL in classrooms helps create supportive environments that help young children or young people, youth and children, to learn how to stay focused, to take initiative and set, academic or personal goals, and to manage stress, which are all integral to learning and do help then for children to arrive at the right answer, help them to arrive at the right answer that they're looking for. Next slide, please. And there are many benefits that SEL imparts to the student and to our society at large. So first and foremost, SEL is research shown to improve academic outcomes. A prominent study found an 11 percentile point gain on academic achievement for students participating in quality SEL programs. Research also shows that children with quality SEL programming are more likely to graduate on time, attain post-secondary education, and gain full-time employment by age 25. It also reduces behavioral issues in schools, disciplinary infractions, makes it less likely that students will be justice system involved. It can help and prevent bullying, and it also improves student relationships with educators. And then also critically, making sure our students have access to SEL is also really important to our state economy, especially with large corporations like Intel now in Ohio seeking a diverse and qualified workforce. And business leaders all over the world have really made it very clear that social and emotional skills are the top skills that they're looking for in their workforce. In an example here from a survey from the World Bank Group, nearly 80% of employers say SEL skills are the most important qualities for job success. And there's a saying that I've heard many times before, and that is that you get hired on the hard skills and fired on the soft skills. And many Ohio business leaders would absolutely agree. And that's why we see so much alignment in the Ohio Means Jobs Readiness criteria that was developed by Ohio business leaders with SEL skills and the competencies outlined in Ohio's SEL standards. And it's also important to note here that social emotional learning skills in the workforce will absolutely grow in even greater importance as our economy changes in the 21st century. Next slide. And so here, I also want to point out, especially in light of it being Mental Health Awareness Month, SEL improves health outcomes, both in the short and in the long term. Studies show that supporting SEL skills in young people like self-awareness, self-management, and responsible decision-making have long-lasting effects, including lowering rates of depression and anxiety later in life, and lower rates of risky behaviors. And so on the screen here, I have some data. This is all pre-pandemic data, but there's no doubt that COVID-19 has greatly exacerbated an already growing child and youth mental health crisis. Isolation, grief, lack of socialization opportunities, loss of loved ones, trauma, loss of family income, all of these things have contributed to declines in child and youth mental health. And we know before the pandemic that experts estimated that 1 in 5 school-age children had experienced some kind of mental health challenge. But that number now, researchers estimate, is up to 4 in 5 children. And so given this alarming data, given what our youth are going through right now, it's really critical that we're equipping them with the tools that they need to recognize, to manage, and to learn from difficult emotions, and to seek help when they need it. And so one critical point here that I just want to make very clear is that SEL supports mental health, but they're not the same thing. SEL is not mental or behavioral health care, but it can help in early identification of something more serious a young person might be dealing with, and then lead to referrals of more intensive individualized support by a mental or behavioral health professional. And then, so lastly here, I think I'm a little over my time, but before I hand things over to Andrew, one thing that I did want to just make sure to bring up too in regarding a critical consideration for SEL programming in schools and making sure that it is high quality is that we really need to make sure that social emotional learning is prioritizing equity. Equity in education is when each child has access to relevant experiences, academic experiences, and educational resources necessary for success across a whole lot of different demographics and many different factors. And so in practice, high quality SEL programming recognizes that children come into the classroom with different strengths, different backgrounds, experiences, and unique needs. And it aims to create inclusive and positive learning environments that allow every child to feel valued, safe, and supported to reach their full potential. So it's really important, I think, here also when talking about equity and SEL, which can come under a lot of fire depending on who you might be talking to. But it's really important to acknowledge that when divorced from equity, SEL as a tier 1 kind of universal support in a school can actually be harmful to a child's mental health, in particular students of color or students who are LGBTQ+. And this can happen by having a curriculum that affirms white, patriarchal, heteronormative, or ableist values that may ask children struggling with something much larger and much more systemic to manage their emotions, or to be resilient in the face of something like racism. And this could constrict their identities in a way that could harm their mental health by not recognizing students who they are and acknowledging the whole of their experiences in and outside of the classroom. And so, lastly, I would just say that centering equity and implementation of SEL programming, helping schools to address community wellness by working to address social determinants of health and understand how they impact students' educational experiences, their mental health, and overall well-being is just really important. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and hand it over to Andrew, who's going to be getting into what's really happening in schools, how this is operationalized, and how the skill building is done in practice.
Thanks, Allison. I appreciate. Thanks for having me today to the coalition. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm a school social worker for the Sheffield Lake City Schools, which is in Lorain County. I'm also a local president of our bargaining unit that represents the all certified staff within our district. I do a lot of work with the Higher Education Association, who I know is a partner of the coalition. Do a lot of work around the OEA Wellness Cadre. And the OEA Wellness Cadre really was mobilized at the beginning of the pandemic. So we're looking March or April of 2020. And it was a way to mobilize a portion of OEA's 125,000 members in order to support membership with spouses of teachers or educators who may die during the pandemic, designed to support school districts with losing teachers while the students were learning at home. And so we mobilized our school counselors, our school social workers, our school psychologists, and our school nurses from across the state to create this cadre of support. And what we found out is these are the experts. These are the experts in the field. These are the experts in the school buildings who are day in and day out going in and supporting students, supporting fellow staff members. It was really an opportunity for us to use our professional skills as wraparound service and student support workers in order to share professional skills, observe trends, discuss programming, recommend programming for students, or supports that they had in each local. Because we know across the state, every school district is different. And we know that their level of need and support is different. So how do we implement, the social emotional learning is this framework. And it's really about self, and it's really about other. It's really about communication. It's how do we identify these feelings that we have? How do we identify? How do we observe? How do we become aware of our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors? That triangle is really interconnected. So early childhood mental health work really mimics early childhood literacy. The younger we can teach these skills of understanding our body, or what are these feelings that we are feeling, whether it's in our stomach, in our head, what body parts we're feeling, and then identifying, putting a label, and labeling what these feelings are and how do we manage them. So identifying emotions, how do we regulate them? We know in lots of people, and we used to say, we can see this in toddlers and little kids, that when they can't communicate and can't articulate, it comes out as a behavior where I'm hitting, or I'm punching, or I'm kicking. And we still see those behaviors in adults as well, with their inability to communicate or to resolve conflict. Instead, we end up just punching people in the face. And then we get into this system of legal issue and all of that. So we do this really in a kind of a multi approached, these different techniques. We are rolling out this program in building levels. We are working with kids to help them identify emotions. We are working with students in order to help them be problem solvers. We know that we want students, when they graduate from high school, to be able to work with others and work as a team. We know many jobs, there are not a lot of jobs that are done in isolation. So we have to be able to have an ability to communicate, to be able to reframe, or to be empathetic, to be able to see the situation, whether it's in an argument, or be able to see someone else's perspective, to be able to view that situation through another lens. So we are really working, and we are making progress. In Ohio, we are making progress as we are in this endemic stage of this global pandemic. We are making progress. It is not at the rate that I think that we thought that it would be. I think we were hoping for a little bit more speed. However, a lot of these things, we're seeing more growth since beginning of 2022. We are seeing more growth in terms of reducing social isolation, bringing students together, working on them to detach from technology, how to reintegrate, and how do we get students face to face to have communication, to rebuild and repolish and strengthen these skills of interpersonal. How do we relate? And a lot of it is really about understanding and being able to analyze and reflect, and to be able to see the situation. We provide those things are at a very tier one, very universal level. Through these processes, we are really identifying people who need additional supports, whether they have suffered from an event in their life, which we call an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. These are things that they have witnessed, they observed, whether it's a form of abuse or neglect, or if students have experienced a traumatic divorce, if they're are impoverished, in poverty, that there are our kids bring a lot to school, and our role is to help them sort that out in order to manage what they can in order to be the most successful, productive learner. Okay, and we do that so we can get them to focus on learning. So we provide these levels of supports. Okay, so teaching everybody and having a variety of these awareness and emotional regulation strategies, working with licensed clinicians and licensed educators in order to use small group instruction and to provide check-ins and to monitor students in order to kind of close that SEL or learning gap that we have seen that has been exacerbated during the pandemic. And then for our at most high risk and vulnerable populations, providing levels of care, whether it's access to physical health and having access to medical care, dental care, providing an infrastructure of food insecurity, food bank programs, or other to provide fresh produce and frozen meats, teaching parents to bringing them back to school in order to work on the cooking skills, vocational skills that people often use, returning to home ec class, so we can have sustainability, so families can really level up, and we talk about that from a gaming. So if you have any children or grandchildren who are gamers, we are consistently wanting to level up. I would say that we know that, from the kind of business community, I will comment that we work a lot. Primarily, a lot of my work is done in grades 7 through 12, and work with a lot of business folk who really talk about these executive functioning skills, being able to organize, time management, what is going to take you 5 minutes, showing up to work and being ready, being prepared, tackling problems, that these things are essential to have our students be really college and career ready. So hopefully it gives you a little, overview of the different levels of supports and SEL of the framework in Ohio, and I'm happy, I guess, to answer any questions that have come up during the presentation.
That would be great. If anyone has specific questions for Andrew, we'll let him field those now. I know there's at least one question in the chat, I think related to Alison's content, but if anyone wants to enter something or speak up, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask Andrew directly. Andrew, I'll introduce one question. What would you recommend as a response to what I'm projecting? Because I don't know exactly what the criticisms are specifically related to the work you're doing as a component maybe of social and emotional learning, but the way SEL is being used against or as part of the anti-honesty in education campaigns is sort of that it's teaching things that it's really up to parents to teach, or it's indoctrinating students about the divisive topics because of their connection to whether it's bullying or placing guilt on students for the wrongs of our past and those kinds of things. So what would you recommend responding to people who are criticizing social and emotional learning and this level of emotional support for kids in the school system as it relates to curriculum?
I think that, social emotional learning, or SEL, has been, politically grouped right into CRT, and this critical race theory that these things are about being binary, us versus them, when in fact that is, misinformation. These skills are about preparing students to be productive members of teams, to be able to manage manage their own life and decision making, and to be able to recognize in others duty to warn or a duty to alert. Whereas we know that if students are at high risk for student suicide, if they're contemplating suicide, or if they are having if they're having issues at home and they are, struggling with processing or understanding, or they are abused, that they are more likely to go with a friend to go get help than to go by themselves. So we teach these strategies about what are we looking for in terms of red flags, changes of behaviors, things that students may mention to as peers. So we teach friends in order to recognize what are red flags, what things should we observe, and then how do we ask? How do we ask the question? Have you considered hurting yourself? Are you in need? Can we go together and get help? So kids, the response rate for having a friend recognizing that there is that there's a situation going on is paramount in getting them to go, whether it's a trusted adult, and how to identify trusted people who can help. We always want to make sure that we are teach students that it doesn't have to be always heading to the office. We teach our bus drivers, we teach our cafeteria workers, we teach our study hall, our teachers, our principals. Okay, what do you do when you get this information? How do we help students? Who do we refer to?
Wow, that's great. There was one question posted, and it was during Allison's talk, but I think, either or both of you may answer that, but it's generally your impression, and Allison, please jump in. Do we know what's causing the spike in mental health issues among students that you referenced in your presentation?
Sure, and I just made sure to draft a response and put it in the chat. Of course, I think that there's just a multitude of factors that kind of having a root cause analysis of exactly, just with such a diversity of different experiences that children have had throughout the pandemic. Not all children have experienced the pandemic equally, or the burdened it, shouldered the burdens equitably. But I mean, I just gave some examples of, just loneliness being driven by social media and technology, and isolation during the pandemic, and not to mention just before, the impact of the opioid epidemic on many of our communities, and just what children are witnessing, so much in the last few years in terms of just divisiveness and political unrest on a global and national scale. But I did make sure to share an article from the New York Times that was released this week on the teen mental health crisis that I thought was a pretty good piece. And so maybe that would help answer some of those questions.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question? I have at least one more, but I don't want to jump in if someone else wants to unmute and ask.
Yeah, I would say it's partly a question, maybe partly commentary, and then I'm just curious to get like your take on it. You mentioned some of the pushback and the some of the negative pushback on SEL programs, and kind of how it gets sometimes wrapped up in CRT and everything. I personally come from a marketing background where in the marketing world, there's always this concept, right, of moving away from mass marketing to one-to-one individual marketing, where the individual recipient on a very personal level, so you're catering to their needs and wants and wishes. And I'm married to an educator who sees that full range of children that come from very tight-knit homes, and there's no challenges at homes, and and parents are very active and engaged with their education, all the way through to the children where they're coming from highly divisive homes that are broken, and there's all sorts of non-school issues happening in that child's life. And I'm just curious to get the take on, I see a parallel in like marketing to the one-to-one level with like an SEL program where you're trying to say, we need to support these students at a one-to-one level, knowing that you have this such a wide spectrum. And I think it was Allison who just kind of somewhat said something along those lines, where you have such a diverse range of scenarios and backgrounds, from from having parents highly engaged to having parents completely unengaged, and everything in between. So I guess I'm just curious to like, is that a challenge in the SEL implementation, and how you, how do you successfully manage an SEL program when you're trying to, not necessarily broadly, deploy a program, but try to address individual students' needs, knowing that they're all at such different scenarios and circumstances.
I think that I think that those are, I think SEL and I think mental health supports for students and families is super critical. But it's a slow moving animal. It's a slow moving machine. In terms of really staffing. We think of like this response to intervention. I'm not sure if you've heard of that term. It's really this idea behind a triangle. And on this triangle, I'll try to draw on my camera here. The bottom third, a little bit more third, is these universal supports, building level initiatives. These are educating, these are health education, emotional education. And these are things that everybody's going to get. Like everybody's getting math, everybody's getting this level of education. The next part up in the pyramid or the triangle are people, this very small group or students who need a little bit more individualized attention. Maybe it's in the form of a small group working on social skills. How do we summarize back or active listening? How do we manage conflict? Perhaps these are identity issues. It depends on more targeted. And then the top of the pyramid is really this infrastructure of multiple supports. These are children who may be in multiple systems, meaning that they are involved in either foster care or the children's services system, involved in legal or juvenile court, or currently receiving or in need of behavioral health services. So I find, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I see it's really mainly that marketing technique is it's all of that, generalized and then more targeted as we move up based on student need.
Allison, do you want to add anything?
No, I think Andrew covered that question pretty well, and he's got the operational side of things where I think his expertise there is really valuable.
Okay. Does anyone else want to jump in with a quick question? We like to kind of wrap up with a few minutes left over for people's lunch spaces so they can fit actually eating in. So I will just thank our guests so much for the information and their insightfulness in responding to people's questions, and encourage people to continue advocating and letting our state reps know your views on how important SEL is as a facet of our educational system. And thank you so much to everybody for joining today. And again, the information will be uploaded to the Lunch and Learn page on the Honesty for Ohio Education website, where you can also link to events coming in the next month or so and our ongoing take action suggestions to keep the pressure on our state legislature. So thank you, Allison and Andrew. We really appreciate your expertise and your time. Thanks, everybody.
Susan, do you want to unmute and just talk about the League of Women Voters program tomorrow? I know you mentioned it in the chat.
Lisa, do you have all the information at your fingertips? I just know that it's in.
Yes, I'll put a link in the chat right now.
Okay, that people might want to support that.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lisa and Susan.
And the honesty mailing list if you're not on it already.
Always. You can get that again from our website, honestyforohioeducation.info. Just waiting so Lisa can enter a link to an event tomorrow, you said, in the chat. There it is. Oh, that's our mailing list.
And there's the league.
There we
There's
go.
the league event. Come send postcards to elected officials. Join us in Cleveland Heights at 10 a.m. at the Forest Hills Park Picnic Pavilion.
All right. Give people a second to get that copied. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time and your interest.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Allison.
Thanks, Allison. It was just terrific. Thanks, Andrew. Great content.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
Take care.